Welcome, Ryssdal.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming out. I do appreciate it for an early breakfast. You know, last time I was in town a couple of years ago, I did a station event, and it was pouring rain, and people still came out, which I think says a lot about the support for this stage and for public broadcasting in Atlanta. As Milton was saying, by way of thanks, I don't have a job without you guys. At the most fundamental level, we can't do what we do without people like you. And that's true at a station level, and it's true also at a program level. The generosity of your financial contributions and your time makes it possible for us to do the sophisticated, challenging, and important work that public radio and public television do every day. And you hear stories on our air at Marketplace, at WABE, on public broadcasting television stations everywhere that you're just not going to hear on Fox or on CNN or any place else. And I think that truly speaks to why we're all here, because it's a collective undertaking. We can't do it without you, and you guys tune to us for something that I don't think you can get someplace else. So just to pile on Milton's thanks here, thank you again for all you do for public broadcasting. So let's see where to start. Well, first of all, I am an Emory grad, and it is no joke to say that I couldn't get into Emory today, which I think speaks better about the school than it does about me. When I get out and do these events, whether it's with a station or with a school or with a group, I always try to swing by the public radio station in town, and if I can, do the Marketplace broadcast from there. And it's usually a pretty successful undertaking. We usually have some folks coming out who like to watch me for whatever reason speak into a microphone, which I've never really understood, but that's their own thing. I was at WUNC in North Carolina last year. They now call it North Carolina Public Radio. And I said, I'm coming into town for a couple of different things. I'd love to do the broadcast. And they said, great, can we have some people come by? And I said, yeah, sure, absolutely, of course. And they said, super, that's lovely. And they have this great old renovated tobacco barn that is their facility. It's actually called the American Tobacco Campus in downtown Durham, right next to the ballpark, actually, where the Durham Bulls play AAA baseball. And so I showed up, and they have next to their newly renovated studio setup a huge old part of the warehouse that's about as deep as this room, maybe twice as wide, and the ceiling's about twice as high. And they were going to get people in there for a little reception afterwards. And I said, great, that's fine. So I go into the studio and I get ready to do the broadcast, and they set up a little television camera. And they said, we're just going to broadcast this out to, some sets out in the meeting area out there so folks can watch. And I said, great, absolutely, that'd be fine. So I do the show, not really thinking that I'm actually on television as well as being on the radio. And I go out to this crowd, which by the time I had finished the broadcast was about 200 people, watching me speak into the microphone. And there were some titters and some chuckles as I stepped on to the stage, which isn't what usually happens. So I knew right away something was a little fishy. And I noticed that behind me, on a wall twice this height, was the television picture that they had been watching. It wasn't just a couple of TV sets. It was me, about 40 times larger than life. So we had a very nice session, a lot of good Q&As and a lot of questions about me and my background and where I came from. And by the way, let me just pause here and say this is always more fun for me, and I think for the listeners and for the audience as well, if you guys have questions. So I'll speak for a little bit, but then I'm going to open it up to questions. And please, whatever's on your mind about Marketplace or broadcast or the news or the markets, just let me know, and we can certainly have a little conversation about that. Back to North Carolina, though. So we have our good session, and then we go to a fundraiser event at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Durham. And I'm meeting people and chit-chatting. And I step over to one of the development staff, and I say, so how do you think it's going? How do you think it went, the broadcast? And she said, oh, it was fine. I said, what, fine? What do you mean fine? Fine's not what I'm looking for. And she said, well, it was okay right up to that point where you scratched yourself inappropriately. And so there's me on the wall, 40 feet tall, not really thinking that I'm on television while I'm actually on the radio. So the trick is that that's why I'm on the radio, not on television. So, let me start with a little bit about Marketplace. Hopefully many of you, most of you, all of you, one hopes, have heard the program and you know what we do. But let me tell you the secret behind the broadcast. And the secret really is an easy one. And that is this. None of us, not me, not my producer, not the engineers, none of us care about business. I don't care that General Motors lost $10.6 billion last year. I don't care that Standard & Poor's has just downgraded $6.8 billion worth of subprime debt. We're not interested in that. Because as soon as I go on the radio and say, Standard & Poor's downgraded $6.8 billion, nobody's listening to that, right? The sound you're going to hear is radios clicking off all over the country, because that's not what they tune into this broadcast for. What they're interested in are the stories behind that. The stories that we tell using people and places and events that let you understand why it's important. Why now, for the first time in 45 years of working life, a GM retiree has to try to figure out what a doctor's office copayment is all about, because he's never had to do that. Or what it means when somebody's home is foreclosed because of the subprime mortgage mess. Those are the stories we try to tell you in as much detail and in as much depth as time allows, while still keeping it interesting. When I sit down to write the show every day, we go on the air at 2 o'clock live in Los Angeles. Hits 5 o'clock drive time on the East Coast. WNYC takes it live. A lot of other stations do. Some take it and tape it and roll it over. So I sit down about noon or so in Los Angeles, and I write the show. I start actually at the bottom, and I take the last piece, and I listen for a little while, and then I try to write some kind of creative introduction. And I work my way up through the broadcast until finally I get to the top. And I've established some kind of through line, some kind of arc for the program that's going to take you guys from that opening gong to the final bell in a way that's cohesive and comprehensive. And when I write, I'm not writing for the Wall Street types, even though they do listen, because they call us and they tell us that they listen. And I'm not writing for PhDs and economists. I'm actually writing for my mom, because I figure if I can get my mom to understand what the subprime mortgage mess is all about, then I can get anybody to understand it. You also have to understand that I'm a history and political science guy. I've never taken an economics course. I don't have a stock trading license. I will say, by way of disclosure, my wife's an MBA, but she handles all our money and the whole deal. If I can't understand it, then I can't make it make sense to you. And that's what Marketplace is all about. Taking this story, these stories that are fabulously dense and amazingly complex and really, really dull if you don't do it right, and unpacking them in a way that everybody can understand. Whether it's a story from our sustainability desk about global warming, or our entrepreneurship desk and Steve Tripoli up in Boston, or Helen Palmer at the help desk, or our bureaus in Washington, or New York, or Miami, or our staff of reporters in Los Angeles. Not one of us care about the numbers. It's just not good radio. But if we take some time and really try to delve into what it is that makes these stories relevant, then I think we've got some programming that you guys are going to want to listen to and that the stations are going to want to carry. Let me talk just briefly about what's coming up on the program, and then I'd love to take some questions from you guys to figure out what's on your mind, because the real benefit of me getting out of the studio, and there is nothing worse than being a studio-bound host. Anybody out there who's ever been on television and radio understands that there's nothing worse than being trapped in a studio, which, even though it's a whole lot of fun, is only me and my microphone. It doesn't really give me a sense of what people are thinking about the program or about what we're trying to do on the radio. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to Mike Eskew out at UPS. He's the CEO out there for a series we do called Conversations from the Corner Office. It's actually been a pretty successful venture. We've been working on it for about a year and a half now. I've done everybody from Sumner Redstone to Sumner Redstone at Viacom. He's 84, by the way, worth $8.3 billion and about as crotchety as you could possibly imagine. I think he actually yelled at me, and I think we played that tape on the radio. You should go to the website and have a listen. Bob Iger at Disney. Bob Iger is tremendously confident, clearly, obviously competent at what he does, but really very uncomfortable about being interviewed. So here's a guy who runs Disney, right? That's ABC, that's ESPN, that's theme parks. I mean, that's the whole shooting match, right? One of the biggest entertainment companies on the planet. We had, for his interview, 45 minutes. He was 5 minutes late, so we had 40 minutes, and his head of communications was sitting there with a watch out on the table. So I've got a little bit of time to warm him up and then get into the good stuff and then really get going. He sat for the first 25 minutes of our 40 minutes like this in his chair, right? Answering like this, yes, no, yes, right? And so I'm trying to get 3.5 minutes out of good radio out of Bob Iger. It's killing me. I eventually got him, and I eventually got him to admit that he does get sneak preview copies of Desperate Housewives and all the good shows. He would not actually tell me what the endings were, but, you know, that's all right. So anyway, Mike Eskew. So we're going to talk today, and you'll hear this on the program in about a week or so. We're going to talk about globalization with him and where a company like UPS would be without the internet and e-commerce. And how really it's a technology company now and not a parcel delivery company. Because if I send you something via UPS and I go to the UPS website and hit their tracking function, I can know when you've gotten your package practically before that driver gets back to his van off your doorstep. Mike Eskew is the guy who made technology happen at UPS. And so we're going to talk for a while about that. We're going to talk about free trade and how this guy whose income and livelihood are completely dependent on globalization feels about the political consequences of free trade not being so popular in Washington, D.C. anymore. I think it's going to be a really good snapshot of the classic marketplace story. How you can take these economic issues, how you can take business and finance and money and use it as a lens into a whole lot of other things that affect us in our daily lives. Later this fall, we'll be airing a series called Consumed, about the consumer economy. If you read Adam Smith, he says, what's the economy for? It's for consumption. It is to consume. That is the end purpose of the economy. I didn't get much farther than that in The Wealth of Nations, but I got that far. Question is, though, can we consume ourselves right out of existence? We're going to do it across all the Marketplace programs, the Morning Report, Marketplace, and Marketplace Money, our weekend personal finance show. We're going to open the first day of the broadcast from the port of Long Beach, which is in many ways the mouth of the consumer economy in the United States. Cargo ships right now coming in from China are carrying Christmas toys that are going to be on your shelves in about 4 to 5 months. We're going to have a look at how the consumer economy affects everything that we do in the United States. What we buy, how we buy it, where we go to buy it. It's going to be actually quite a set of programming. And then next spring, if we have our timing right and if fates conspire with us, not against us, we'll be taking Marketplace to the Middle East. We went to China a year and a half ago. Some of you might have heard that broadcast. We did a week from Shanghai and a week from Chongqing out in southwest Sichuan province. And we will be in the Middle East. Don't know where yet. Don't know exactly when, so don't tell anybody. But that's where we'll be. And arguably it's a bigger challenge than figuring out the biggest market in the world, figuring out how the Middle East plays into our sense of economic and national and political security. Let me take a break for some water. You guys think about what questions you might have, and just raise your hand and we'll get going. Oh, there has to be somebody. Don't be shy. Yes, sir?
You talk about how globalization affects corporations and businesses every day. But how is it affecting you and what you do?
Complicating it by a factor of a lot. I'll give you a great example. We had a story on the program yesterday. Bob Moon, our senior business correspondent, did it for us, about Rio Tinto taking over Alcan, the aluminum company of Canada. And we were sitting around the morning meeting yesterday. Every morning at 8 o'clock LA time, we gather in the war room, our conference room, with a big whiteboard behind us. And the 10, 12 core staff members get together, the editors having talked to their bureaus and their reporters, the rest of us having read up and talked to our sources, and we'll just throw ideas on the board about what we want to be on the program that day. Bear in mind that Marketplace is 28 minutes and 45 seconds long. Once you subtract funders and the numbers and cutaways and musical bridges, the news hole on any given day is about 22 minutes and 30 seconds, which really is that, you know? We pre-produce some amount of our material, anywhere from 6 minutes to 12 minutes worth. So we're going to have probably 10 or 12 minutes worth of stuff that we're going to have to fill from the whiteboard. We were sitting around yesterday, and obviously the Alcan Rio Tinto story was huge. The Dow closed up 283 points yesterday, but it was clear from the opening bell that it was going to be a gangbuster kind of day. And then finally, Patty Hirsch, our brand new New York editor, said, you know, this is really interesting because you have Rio Tinto, which is not Spanish but British Australian, trying to take over a Canadian company, which had been involved in a merger deal with an American company, Alcoa, and it's going to banks in Scotland, Germany, France, and I think it was Russia to get the money. And it was the classic globalization story. You almost can't do business these days anymore without being somehow affected by the global economy. We could go to Peachtree Street, downtown, and within 45 seconds find a company or a person whose life is affected every single day, for better or for ill, by the concept of globalization and what it means. I'm going to actually ask Mike Eskew about this, because I read, in doing some research on him, I read a great quote from him. And he was asked about the negative effects of globalization, about workers losing their jobs. And he said, you know, when you get to this, and the sensitivity of this topic, the anecdote always wins. You will never have a comeback to some guy who says, I lost my job making machine parts for Ford because some guy in Guangzhou province, China, can do it for 14 cents an hour. You're never going to have a comeback for that, right? But I'm curious as to what he's going to say beyond the little quip that he had about the anecdote. So tune in a week and you'll see how that went. Yes, sir, in the back.
I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate all the background you give to what's going on when decisions are being made in high-power economic settings. But a lot of the world is poor and at the edge of the market or outside the market, both in this country and around the world. And I wondered what your interest is in addressing the people at the edges of the market without the ability to participate in the market, without financial resources, without power to make these kinds of decisions.
You bet. Our interest in addressing that segment of the economy, because they are a part of the economy, is large. And I'll tell you what, I think we do a much better job of it in our foreign coverage than we do in our domestic coverage. Excuse me. We do, in our foreign coverage, we have Scott Tong in Shanghai. We have Miranda Kennedy in India and Afghanistan. We have Gretchen Wilson in Africa. All three of those reporters file compelling stories about life on the fringes of the global economy. We're working on a story on a series right now called, in point of fact, Working, about the daily life of a single worker in the global economy. And it actually has yielded some really interesting results. A mine clearer in Bosnia, a folk singer in the former, not the Czech Republic, in one of the Eastern European states. All of that said, though, I think our failure in covering the lower end of the economic spectrum is most apparent in our domestic coverage. I think because the press of our news hole, which I mentioned, and the day's events. I mean, you know, the global economy is a big place, and there's a lot to do. I think our daily coverage lacks in that area of the economy. Yes, ma'am.
You have obviously a lot of the leading executives in corporate America. Is there an interview that you haven't done yet that you'd like to do? Who would be the next executive you'd like to?
You know, that's a good question. You know, if we keep plugging, we're going to get them all. But I think there's, right? I mean, come on. I'm a young guy, and
The one that you're most intrigued by.
well, I'll give you the category, okay? And when we sat down to create this series, we said, okay, we want people who are entrepreneurs, who have started a company and built it into a big company. We want people who are second generation. We want people who can tell us what it's like to fail at a business and then get going, and all kinds of things. And we had a category that I labeled, don't let the door hit you in the fanny on the way out. And we went after Michael Eisner and Carly Fiorina, right? People who have been canned excruciatingly publicly, and what that's like. So that, I think, would be the next big sector of the executive branch that we'd look to get. They both said no, by the way. So, you know, we actually almost had Carly, but then she backed out. She had a book coming out, so. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit more about your personal history after Emory to how you got to the
Sure. How much time do we have? I'll give you the medium-length story of what is a pretty long tale. I graduated from Emory in the spring of 1985. Actually, back then it was June of 85 because they were still on quarters or whatever it is. A week and a half later, I packed everything in my car and went down to Pensacola, Florida, and went to flight school. Spent 8 years in the Navy. Flew for a while, worked at the Pentagon, got a graduate degree, and by the time 8 years was up, I had done everything I joined the Navy to do. But I wanted to keep going overseas on the government dime, so I took the Foreign Service exam for the State Department. I was accepted and wound up in Ottawa, Canada. Hello. Same day New York Times, and you can watch Katie and Bryant on the Today Show. It just didn't do it. But then wound up in Beijing, China. My wife, who I had met in our Foreign Service training school, we were assigned to Beijing together. And for a whole lot of reasons, we decided that it was time for us to get out of the State Department. Me, because I had been in government by that point for 12 or 13 years. She, because she wanted to go to graduate school. She got accepted to the MBA program at Stanford. And I said, yeah, we're going to Palo Alto. I mean, there was really no question. And I figured, this was 1997, and I figured, there's that internet thing in Silicon Valley, and I'll get a job doing something there. It took me about a second to realize I had no interest in doing any of that stuff. So I got a job at the Borders bookstore on University Avenue in Palo Alto, shelving books for $7.25 an hour. I started actually at $7, and I got a raise. I apologize for my scratchy throat. But I was 34 years old, freshly married, about to have a baby, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And if you've ever been in that place, whether it's 24 or 34, it's really not a nice place to be. And I moped around a good deal that summer. Steph was busy taking preparatory courses to get ready for the math in the MBA program. And I moped around the house for a while. And finally she sat me down and she said, you know what, you need to get your head out of your and think about what you want to do. And here's what I think you ought to do. I think you ought to try journalism. You're this weird news freak who gets up at 5 o'clock on a Saturday morning to read the Saturday New York Times before anybody else does. You're always tuning into public radio. You're listening to the news or you're watching the news. You're the most informed person I've ever seen who's not in journalism. You have to give it a try. And I said, yeah, okay, fine, sure, whatever. And then about a week and a half later, I was at the bookstore at closing time. And as you probably know at a bookstore, at closing time, there are books all over the place, right? And you have to... The staff goes around and picks them up and puts them back on the shelves. And I found myself, I kid you not, in the career and counseling section one night at quitting time. I reached for the next book, and it's a book on internships. And for whatever reason, I started flipping through it, and I found the name and the address of the senior news editor at KQED, which is the public radio station in San Francisco. And so I wrote him a letter, and I said, Dear Mr. Musiker, my name is Kai Ryssdal, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. I have no professional journalism training. However, I've had a varied and interesting career. Can we please meet? He called me, and he said, why don't you come up and talk to us? And so I put on my very best State Department suit, which I think actually was this suit. Different tie, but this suit. And I had my little briefcase, right? And if you've ever walked into a public radio newsroom, you know that people walking in suits and ties are looked at a little funny because that's not what public radio reporters wear. And so we had a really nice meeting, and he said, obviously I can't give you a job, but why don't you come and intern for us a couple of days a week, and we'll teach you how to do radio. So I cut back my hours at the bookstore, and I sat down in the conference room 3 weeks later with all the other interns who were like 19 years old, right? But we learned how to hold a microphone and how to cut tape with a razor blade and splicing tape and a grease pencil, right? How to conduct an interview where you don't actually say anything, where what you want is the guy on tape, and so you're going, right? And you're giving those nonverbal feedbacks and all that stuff. And basically I stuck around long enough so that they asked me to come in and start help producing the morning news. If I could get there at 5 o'clock, they could, put me on a sort of a half-day thing. And I'm like, great, fine, whatever. And they started paying me. And then, I started sticking around later and doing some other production work. And 6 months after that, I actually got a personal contract for 6 months. And then about a year and a half after I started, they actually let me on the air. And I did my own reporting. And so I started doing some general assignment reporting. And I wound up eventually, after about 2 years, anchoring the local afternoon news and then the morning news, and then finally a program they have called the California Report, which is broadcast statewide. And somebody at Marketplace heard me and said, listen, we have this opening for an overnight host. Can you come down and talk to us about it? And I said, yeah, no, I really can't. Thanks very much. My wife was 10 days overdue with our second child. And I said, I can't do it. And so I called my wife and I told her Marketplace had called, because I thought that was pretty cool that Marketplace was calling me. And she said, babe, Marketplace really only calls you one time. So I called him back. And I said, listen, with the understanding that I might have to leave at any time, could I come down and talk to you? And they said, sure. And here I am. I got back in time for the birth of the baby. We moved to Los Angeles, and I started at Marketplace in July of 2001. And that's sort of the medium-length story. What's a very long tale. A lot of serendipity, a lot of being in the right place at the right time, and a lot of just finding something that I really enjoy doing. The first actual piece I got on the air wasn't even my piece. When you're an intern, you get sent out to do all kinds of scut work on behalf of the real reporters. But one of the things you do is you supply fodder for the newscasts. And one variation of that is called a cut and copy, where the mayor is going to have a press conference. And so the news director says, go down and get some tape of the mayor and come back and write a cut and copy for this afternoon. So you go down to the press conference, you put your mic in the stand, and the mayor blathers on about whatever it is. And you say, all right, that's going to be the story for today. You go back, you isolate your tape, you get the 18 seconds of the mayor saying, we are building these housing units because San Francisco is a growing city, blah, 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 whatever. You write some copy on top that says, Mayor Willie Brown today said blah, blah, blah. You hear the mayor, and then the anchor comes back and says, the housing will be available in 2009, right? So you write up that package, you get your tape, and you give it to the afternoon anchor. And at that point, I was taking the train back and forth from Menlo Park up the San Francisco Peninsula to San Francisco. And when I would ride the train home, I would have my Walkman on, and I would listen to KQED, the newscast, in the afternoon. And so that day, I sat down on the train for the ride. The 4:30 news came on, and I had my headphones on, and I hear the anchor doing my story. And I was like, I was just on the radio. And it was the coolest thing that I had ever thought, And that was it. And so that was 7.5 years ago, 8 years ago now. And here I am. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I'm one of the people that retired from one career after over 30 years and started working again. And that's, I think, a domestic economy issue. Comment on that. How do you see that transitioning where more and more retirees are taking a second career?
I think there are two thoughts. One is pleasant and one is not. The first that is pleasant, which I hope is your case, is that you found yourself with extra energy and extra time. And maybe you wanted a little extra cash and you wanted to stay involved and be dynamic. And you went out and found yourself something to do so you don't drive your family crazy and you're not playing on the golf course all day. And that's a great part of this economy, right? That we have now this resource of people who are still vital at the age of whatever age you are, There you go. But we have these people who are still vital and who can still contribute in ways that are meaningful for you and for us as a society. The other less pleasant version, which I hope is not your case, is that these people are forced to work, whether it's by rising costs of health care or real estate or the spouse has lost a job, whatever it is. And that, I fear, is the larger part of the equation. And that is the great social dilemma. How we tap into that group of people in a way that is for them meaningful and lets them meet their needs without having to take substandard, difficult, low-paying jobs. I don't have the answer, but I think that's the great social dilemma there. Sir?
How do we change our educational system to prepare a young person for the world economy?
I think mostly we need to expose them to the world economy. And I will refer you to studies showing that kids can't find New York City on a map, let alone Afghanistan. We need to prepare them for the fact that, you know what? It is cutthroat out there. And by the time a sixth grader today is my age, the U.S. economy is not going to be the biggest economy in the world. Right? The Chinese economy in the next 23 years, plus or minus, will be the biggest economy in the world. That's going to mean a completely different mind shift for Americans of 2030, right? Because of all the ancillary things, some benefits, some not, that come with being the driver of the international economy, right? Some studies show that the Chinese economy is going to be an $80 trillion economy by 2030, 2035. The American economy today, about $13 trillion, right? I think that, in and of itself, is the driver for us making sure that our young people are exposed to, interested in, and prepared for. You know, the specifics of it, I don't know. I'm not an educator. But I think exposure to those very basic facts will in themselves speak volumes. Sir?
Let me go back to the career change question.
Yeah. You looking for a job?
Pardon?
You looking for a job?
No, we're not.
Says his boss.
I'm not so interested in this person's politics or what this person's causes are now. What I'm most interested in is Al Gore's transformation into an incredibly successful and wealthy businessman. What's your opinion? Have you interviewed him? What is your opinion of him?
I have.
Transformation into
Well, I think it's a fascinating thing, and you know, I was a history poli-sci major, but I'm no trained observer of the political scene. But I'll offer you these thoughts. I think the year 2000 was liberating for Al Gore. You know, I mean, I think he went off and crawled in a hole for 6 months, came out weighing 30 pounds more and had a beard, but it was probably the best thing that could have happened for him. In all honesty, I personally don't think he's going to run. I don't think he's interested in that stuff at all. I think that he is now able to, without fear of political consequence, work on issues that have been important to him, the record shows, for 25 years. You know, I mean, Earth in the Balance was what, 1988, 89, something like that? Say what you will about him discovering the internet and being wooden and all of this stuff. I think now he has the courage of his convictions, whereas perhaps before, politically he didn't, you know? And whether or not the world is better off for that, I don't know, but I think he's raised some really interesting points in the last 18 months that just would not be in the public eye today at the level they are without that documentary, which I frankly still haven't seen. All the way in the back.
A couple of years ago, we were fortunate to bring youth radio to Atlanta.
Oh, yeah.
And thinking about your format, is there any plans to create more of a youth-oriented marketplace version?
That's actually a really good question. Youth Radio is a group originally out of Berkeley, California, which takes high school kids and older adolescents and gets them trained in radio, and then eventually, the good ones, filing for national radio programs, whether it's All Things Considered or Marketplace or Morning Edition or any of the other great programs that are out there. Interesting question about a younger-oriented marketplace, and I think it's interesting because of this. We think of ourselves, and I think our listeners think of ourselves, not necessarily as the younger version of anything, but as a more accessible version. You know what I mean? I think probably the way to address it is not to create a younger marketplace, but maybe do some stories and some programming that are of interest to those kids. I mean, they do some great stuff, and they really bring points of view that, you know, I mean, I'm 43, but it blows me away that these guys are thinking about these things at the age of 16, 17, 18. They're really some talented kids. Sir?
In a consumer economy, we have two, 20 problems, but two that really concern me. One is healthcare, and the other is taxation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what you're seeing from your catbird seat in relationship to some form of coverage for the 47 million of us who don't have it, and whether or not industry and the general public are going to be able to make an accommodation and come up with some sort of a health care plan that might make sense, and whether or not we're going to ever be able to get rid of our current methods of taxation.
Let me take the second question first because it's the easiest. No. Right? I mean, there's lots of talk about flat tax this and reform of the tax code that, but I think for all the best intentions of lawmakers in Washington and experts in the tax code, I just don't think substantial reform will happen in the next 15 years. Let me just pick a number out of thin air. I just think it's too hard. It's too. I'm sorry? Oh, it's too hard. I think it's too hard. I think the financial situation of this country is such that reforming the tax code won't get political traction anyplace. To the second point, or to the first point actually, which I will address second. After the Iraq War, the issue of most concern to Americans for the 2008 presidential election is health care. Do I think that might finally drive some sort of cooperative bipartisan solution to the problem after 2008? Yeah, I do. Whether it's Hillary Clinton or John Edwards or Rudy Giuliani or John McCain, increasingly less likely that it's going to be John McCain, I think whoever's in the White House will have to take this on and will benefit greatly, I believe, from Hillary Clinton's problems that she had in 1993 and 1994, whether or not it's Mrs. Clinton or not. What it might look like, I have absolutely no idea. I don't know if it'll be single payer. I don't know if you'll be able to detach health care from employers. I talked to Rick Wagner, the CEO of General Motors, and he said, you better believe we have to do that. We have 1 million plus people that are, while we meet and honor our obligations to them as retirees from this company, it's killing us. I mean, he didn't say those words, but he said that is what is driving all of this red ink that's coming out of Detroit and the airlines and the steel companies. I mean, legacy retirees and the healthcare issues that they face for these big industrial companies is an enormous problem, and it will be an enormous drag on the economy unless we fix it. And I think just the momentum and the dynamic of the issue will make it such that will be on the top of the list in early 2009. Yes, ma'am?
Recent snafus of products coming out of China have reminded me that a number of years ago there was a big move for Buy American. Is anything still made in America? And what happened to that push to buy made in America products?
You have to look long and hard. I mean, obviously, we still have great manufacturers here, and we still have great industrial base. That said, there is this thing called the China price, right? The Chinese can make something and sell it at a price that still lets them make a profit, sell it at a price in this country that American industrial manufacturers are not able to meet. Is there made in America? Sure. But I think the consumer economy, just to get back to that point again, the consumer economy has driven it to the point where that's not going to be sustainable. And if you want to blame somebody, look around, right? I mean, we're the ones who are going to Target and Walmart and Costco, even though probably in our hearts of hearts, we know exactly what that means. And maybe you want to pay an extra $1 for your laundry detergent. I don't know. But that's really what's going on. What I gather to be the last question, right? Okay. Sir.
I'm kind of mystified by asking about the
Well, it's not an impact on the labor force here, right? That's not what's going on. The impact is macroeconomic. The Chinese government, as a matter of fact, it came out 2 days ago. The Chinese government has $1.3 trillion of foreign reserves. About 70% of that, something like $900 billion, is American money sitting in the Bank of China. Treasury notes, T-bills, corporate debt, all of that stuff, right? So what happens with exchange rates and the balance of trade, the imbalance of trade perhaps is more accurate in this situation. What happens is that the Chinese find themselves owning more American money than most American companies do, right? And so we are now inextricably intertwined with the Chinese economy because they could, at the drop of a hat, all the president of the Central Bank of China has to do one day is speculate about diversifying Chinese foreign reserves, and the dollar's going to fall a nickel against the euro. I mean, it'll happen like that. But here's the catch. He's never going to do that because then that $910 billion that he's sitting on is worth a nickel less, multiplied by $910 billion, right? So I think that is the issue. What the global economy, to get back to a prior point, what the global economy means for everybody, for the global economy, and how it is well nigh impossible to take an action that does not have some equal and opposite reaction somewhere in the world, which will eventually somehow circle back to the United States. And with that, I thank you. Thank you so much. Really cool. Where I came from. And by the way, let me just pause here and say, this is always more fun for me, and I think for the listeners and for the audience as well, if you guys have questions. So I'll speak for a little bit, but then I'm going to open it up to questions. And please, whatever's on your mind about marketplace or broadcast or the news or the markets, just let me know, and we can certainly have a little conversation about that. Back to North Carolina, though. So we have our good session, and then we go to a fundraiser event at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Durham. And I'm meeting people and you know, chit-chatting. And I step over to one of the development staff, and I say, so how do you think it's going? How do you think it went, the broadcast? And she said, oh, it was fine. I said, what, fine? What do you mean fine? Fine's not what I'm looking for. And she said, well, it was okay right up to that point where you scratched yourself inappropriately. And so there's me on the wall, 40 feet tall, not really thinking that I'm on television while I'm actually on the radio. So the trick is that that's why I'm on the radio, not on television. Let me start with a little bit about Marketplace. Hopefully many of you, most of you, all of you, one hopes, have heard the program. And you know what we do. But let me tell you the secret behind the broadcast. And the secret really is an easy one. And that is this. None of us, not me, not my producer, not the engineers, none of us care about business. I don't care that General Motors lost $10.6 billion last year. I don't care that Standard & Poor's has just downgraded $6.8 billion worth of subprime debt. We're not interested in that. Because as soon as I go on the radio and say,